Hey, this is your Great Lakes dude, Jeff Liskay, coming to you on the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where we're going to be going rage angler on all things Great Lakes, from gear, fly, big water, and swinging flies, of course. If it concerns the Great Lakes, we've got you covered, so stay tuned to this next episode. Hey, welcome to the Wet Fly Swing podcast, Great Lakes. I'm your host, Jeff Liskay, a.k.a. Great Lakes Dude. This episode is part 2 of taking the mystery out of choosing the right single-hand or two-handed rod and how to match them with today's modern fly lines to get the job done on the Great Lakes tributaries. Part 1, we covered rods and floating lines. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into sinking lines and two-handed lines. So let's just get things going. Sinking single-hand lines. Well, I have the Great Lakes in my backyard, and it gives me the perfect venue to push the boundaries of sinking lines, but I'm not the first. Jerry Darkes, a good friend of mine, fly fishing industry for a long time, forged away and started the game in the late 90s, along with Captain Brian Meszaros up on Lake St. Clair. I was in it. I was helping out and doing that, but I was not the first, but I have dove deep into it and went down the rabbit hole on my end. If you had told me 10 years ago that presenting your flies at depths of 28 to 31 feet deep in the water column was possible, I might have thought, sure, but there's a lot more room to learn and expand the limits. Fast forwarding to now, I can tell you that with today's modern fly lines, two-handed rods, and the advanced electronics like forward-facing sonar, the game has changed. Back when Jerry started it out, he had some airflow lines that were full sinking, and I think the technology has grown quite fast over the last 10 or 12 years, and all sorts of cutting-edge new line technologies are coming out, so I think the opportunities to explore and push the limits like we've always talked about is becoming more of a reality. The biggest eye-opener was being able to track the fly through the entire presentation all the way back to the boat using forward-facing sonar. It finally gave me confirmation on the water column depth the fly was fishing at, and I learned that the combination of leader length, sinking line grain weight, they really were fishing deeper than I expected. It took the mystery out of it, and it also showed me that with sinking lines, there's a bell curve that happens, right? They start out high, and then your fly tracks down to the deepest point, and then it tracks back up towards the boat. So it's a bell curve, and it was very interesting to see how that all unfolded and how deep I was fishing from a 6 weight up to a 12 weight. So, the possibilities now are endless. So I think it's really been exciting for me on my end just to really unlock all that. And this doesn't really go as much for river, the big river game or river fishing, where you're doing more of a sight to structure and actually visually seeing these fish come out of their home turf, right? But here's a little example of what can be achieved when you think outside the box. One program that stands out the last few years and highlights this new thinking is in late fall on inland lakes where the water levels are being drawn down to make room for snow and ice melt and spring rains, of course. They need to have these reservoirs lowered down to make room, right? Otherwise, they would impede and go over the dam and just cause flooding. But during this time in fall time, and it goes over a couple of months, most of the species migrate out of the channels and the back bays because the water's not being there, and they gravitate to the main deeper river channel and hold on the edge where there's, deep structure, 18 feet or more. If you can find a creek channel with structure that's down there in that 30 feet with some 18-foot structure, that's what you're sort of looking for. But in the past, I would have pulled the plug on trying to fish that deep, fly fishing at least, and never even thought about targeting fish. But I'm actually trying to target muskies, and they're very achievable. The conventional gear anglers are catching them at that time. trollers are, but I just sort of wrote it off as a fly angler, but, not anymore. It's game on. So that just gives you an opportunity to open up your venues that you might not have thought, like, why the heck could I even think about fishing that deep, during those situations? But there's many more pieces of the puzzle, to put in place. But the cool thing is that, pushing the limits of fly fishing sometimes is very rewarding when you can unlock that and get that magic key to the door that opens up a new fishery for you, right? So looking at these sinking lines, and it's just mainly talking about single-hand lines now, single-hand rods, we go by a sink rate, and it's you'll see inches per second, right? That's what this sink line does. And there is 4 categories, which are known as types. So what we call types. So we have the first one, which is an intermediate sinking, and that sinks about 1 to 2 inches per second. Then we have type 3, which is 3 inches per second. We have type 6, which is 6 inches per second. And then type 8, you guessed it, it's 8 inches per second. Now, that's just a reference to, and now that I've used this live forward-facing sonar, I can tell you that, by adding longer leaders, weighted flies, unweighted flies, that's just a reference point that gets you very, very close. We always use a countdown method when we first get out. Like if you get on a good rule of thumb is that we need to understand the sink rate, right, which we do. The next step would be if you're fishing from a pier or if you're fishing off your kayak, or in my case, I'm fishing off of a larger boat. And this goes for if you're fishing in 4 foot or 30 or 50 foot. You need to cast out at the distance that you required, maybe the longest distance possible, and count down and wait till your fly line touches bottom. Whatever that number is, if you're in 4 feet and it takes 5 seconds, then you can divide that water column up into the upper, the middle, the lower, and then on the bottom, 4 categories of water column depth. Sometimes it might take you as long as 20 seconds to get down there, right? There's all sorts of tricks, but that at least now you know that cast distance with that sink rate of sinking line, where you're really at in the water column, because sometimes the fish could be all spread out. Sometimes they're in one certain column that you need to keep your fly traveling through during the whole strip process. So the next is going to be full sinking lines, which means that the full sinking lines sink at that rate. That is going to be all the way through that sink rate. That's going to be the entire fly line sinks at that sink rate of inches per second, or type sink rate. That's going to mean that a little harder to cast. That was, very useful in a lot of areas, but I think mostly today, I think that my preference and a lot of other anglers that are getting into using shooting heads is the shooting head system. The shooting head system is a little easier to cast because the full sinking line is a longer line and it's very, dense, and it can get a little hard to cast at times, especially for, if you're just beginning casting out. So the shooting head system of a sinking line is basically the go-to now. And this is roughly, it's a projectile, sort of like you can imagine like a Skagit head. It's very short. It's around, the whole fly line is roughly 25 to 30 feet. It's a grain weight system, just like a space system. And it's tungsten material that weighs accordingly to the rod, which we'll get into. And behind this short section of weighted tungsten material that has a sink rate, just like we talked about, it has 25 foot roughly what's called a handling line. This handling line is a floating portion, and it's seamless right to this tungsten material. And this is where you would hold it and before you shoot the line, hence why they call shooting line, right? Just like shooting a spade cast. And it's usually the matching diameter of the tungsten material, which is always out towards the front, towards your leader and fly. And then eventually it tapers down from the handling down line down to the shooting line, which is level, and then that goes all the way back and attaches to your backing. So just to give you a little, background, these grain weights of these shooting heads, they start out around 150 grains, and then they max out around 750 grains for saltwater fishing and two-handed musky rods and things like that. So it's a good basic reference is around 200 grains for a 6-weight, and from there you go up 50 grains per rod weight. For instance, a 250 grain would be a 7-weight, and then a 300 grain would be an 8-weight. Sort of just like every system, when you talk about rod ratings and going up, 50 grains is a pretty good basic rule of thumb that a grain window going up or down will get you into the next weight rod class, the numerical system. So that's one of my go-tos, but there's a specialty line out that's a sinking line, which is, it's new, it's not super new, but it's been, from the European brought across the big pond and over to our area, from the two-handed and the single-hand, aspects of it. It's called a multi-density sinking line. And rather than just having one sink rate throughout the whole sinking line or throughout the sinking shooting head, these lines are multi-density, meaning that they have a different sink rate 3 ways. So what they do is from starting at the tip, which is the heaviest sinking portion, the next section would be a little bit lighter sinking, and then the last portion going towards your shooting line would be the lightest. So it sort of gets away from the bell curve. It basically, because you have less sinking material density towards the back of the fly line, it tapers down and gets into a heavier sinking, and it eliminates a little bit of that bell curve that we were talking about. But just to give you an example, they call them 3D lines. So it would be like there's 3 classifications, which are the most popular. It would be like an intermediate, sink 2, sink 3. Then you would have one that's a little bit going to get deeper, which is an intermediate to sink 3 to sink 5. And then if you really want to get down and dirty, we have a sink 3, sink 5, sink 7. And that's the type. And then also we called that inches per second. So you can add those numbers in, realize the larger the numbers, the deeper you're going to fish. So the next category, which has been around for a long time, is sink tip type shooting heads in lines. This is where you have a majority of the fly line or the head, which is floating, and then there's a seamless tip front section of around 5 to 10 feet that sinks accordingly to the sink rate that you're looking to get. And they have them for an intermediate, type 3, type 5, type 7. And that's very popular for trout fishing. It's very popular for fishing subsurface. And you can get down with the weighted fly around 10 feet or so, 12 feet very effectively with that. But it's more for river fishing. It's more for inland lake fishing. It's really good to keep, stay above weed lines if you're fishing in a lake. It's actually very, very good if you're fishing along a shoreline, casting out into a pond or something. So those are very, very popular. Probably the most popular when it comes down to sinking lines are what's called sink tip lines. So let's chat a little bit about my go-to. And this whole, both part 1 and part 2 was, in and around the Great Lakes, because there are just so many different applications all over the United States that you can use all these lines. But, this is going to be focused in my home waters of Steelhead Alley and, Michigan and New York and in the lakes. And my 3 go-to lines, the first one, and of course, there's no secret. This is not an infomercial, but I've been involved with Scientific Angler for a long time. I work with them on line designs and that, and there's all different line brands that all cover all these aspects, like I said. If you're a Rio fan, great. If you're an Airflow fan, great. If a Cortland fan, they all make these lines in some facet or another. But Mine is going to be, my first choice is always with what's called a floating mastery Teton. That's that line we talked a little bit about. It's a very short, weight forward shooting head. I can do so many different things with that line, to put the sink tips on like we talked about. We can use indicator rigs. I can go bass fishing with big air resistant flies. So that gets on all my rods. I have them all through the categories. And I have the sonar is going to be my Sonar Titan Full Intermediate. And this is a full line. It's not a head. I really like my intermediate lines to be a full, longer line system. Because usually when I have the intermediate, I don't need to worry about getting at depth. I'm usually casting far distances in clear water, more like the traditional saltwater angler would. And I need that longer line to be able to carry longer distance cast and control them in all those situations where I'm fishing up on top of a big flat or something like that. And I also use it's my go-to line for night walleye fishing because I don't need to get deep. I do need to make longer casts just to cover a little more water because I'm fishing from shoreline most of the time. And then my last is a Sonar Sync 25 cold. That's my go-to, and there's variations to that. They make it in a cold and a warm, but I usually use the cold, and I fight that temperature break like we talked about of the cores and managing the line without getting tangled. I have many other lines, for different presentations just because, I'm available and I have access to that. But within those three lines in and around the Great Lakes, you can usually get the job done, 70 to 80% of the time. So it's a pretty good base, line to look into those three lines of some way or another.
This year, I ventured into the heart of eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton territory where the fish were larger than life and the waters held the secrets of the best fly fishing out west. With crystal clear rivers like the Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake and enough lakes to keep you going all year long, make your way to Yellowstone Teton territory and embark on a journey to one of North America's finest fly fishing destinations. It's time to experience eastern Idaho for yourself and support this podcast at the same time.
A little FYI, if you're using a consistent stripping retrieve for surface flies, where you're not letting it pause for a long period of time and you're using a pretty, strip and burn late summer, warmer water temperatures, and you're using poppers or you're using waking flies, I actually use my intermediate line for that. That little bit of sink, it allows that popper or that waker to dig in a little bit more. It also works, very well on deer hair flies if you want to get it just to dig a little bit more than the surface, just to give it a little bit more of a disturbance on the water. It's not really good. You can't use it for dead drifting poppers. You can't use it for dead drifting waking on the rivers because it'll eventually sink and it won't have the proper presentations. But think about it if you're just doing a constant strip. We can chat forever just on one line type, but the combination, as we talked about, with those three lines and adding leader length, because remember, if we add really, really long leaders, a lot of times I'm fishing 12-foot to 15-foot nylon leaders or fluorocarbon leaders with weighted flies to get jigging action, adjusting with weighted flies and unweighted flies. The options are sort of endless now of what depth you can fish at, which is a pretty cool thing. It's pretty eye-opening now of, being able to fish deep and taking advantage of it, because I think freshwater with sinking lines is different from saltwater. Most of the time, as you can know, as a saltwater angler, it's a lot of sight fishing. It's a lot of shallow water wading in flats. Even when you get out in the blue water, these fish are up in the water column and they're hot to trot, right? But sometimes in freshwater, we need to get down and dirty with them and get down in the water column because the water is stratifying and they're not happy up in the top water column, or fishing deep structure too. So let's move on. Let's take a look at my favorite line category. The two-handed and spey line category is one that I geek out about, right? And this is going to go for single hand or two-handed rods. there's always a wow factor when you get the right line on your two-handed or switch rod or your single hand. There's a wow factor. Also, with so many different rod designs, and sometimes you might actually need to go way over or under the recommended grain weight window to get that wow feeling, right? You know it. That feeling when the line or the head just wants to come off the rod tip like a rocket, right? And then it just shoots into the next area code and it bounces back towards you. You're like, what happened? Was my cast better? No, that's just that you've got that line and that rod matched to exactly your personality, and your stroke, right? So it's always that wow factory. And so interesting thing about it is that, always be open to try new lines or different grain weights until you get that wow factory on your rod, right? I had one time or a couple of various times that we couldn't figure out a switch rod. And we kept trying up or down a little bit, and it just still felt a little doggy, right? So we went way outside the box. It was a 7-weight switch rod, 11-footer, and, that should be right in around 350 grains max. Well, we ended up putting 525 grains on this switch rod, and the rod turned into that wow factor. So realistically, it wasn't a switch rod. It was actually a short spay. So they just the brand had it labeled a little wrong, and and it didn't feel as stiff, but the way the taper was and the materials were, it needed 525 grains to load, which totally, took us all for a loop. Like, what the heck? Now, how many of these two-handed lines and which ones do we really need, right? Lines and heads have different lengths. A head is a shooting system, like we talked about, where this head is a projectile, and it can get a little cloudy. The road's not clearly marked, right? Because if you get into a traditional integrated spay line, they can get really long, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But let's just go back to the home water thought. Where do you plan on fishing the most, right? In and around the Great Lakes, we do have some opportunities to use some of the longer traditional spay lines, but in general, I think you'll find yourself using the shorter shooting heads being more productive in and around the Great Lakes, just because of the size of the rivers and the characteristics of our migratory trout, right? They're not summer runs, most of the rivers are going to be fall, winter, spring, where the water's cold and these fish aren't going to come to the surface. So you'll find those shooting heads will be, with sinking tips, will be more effective. But so we talked a little bit about, in part one, we talked about AFTA, the American Fly Fishing Trade Associations, that has this standards of a guideline for single-hand rods. They also have it for two-handed rods too. So check out AFTA, AFFTA, AFTA, American Fly Fishing Trade Association. The industry uses that for a lot of recommendations, and through the industry for all different things too. For outfitters and guides like myself, it's our platform. And it breaks it down more precisely. But they break it down in their standards as shooting heads, which are 30 to 50 feet long, short bellies, which are 50 to 60 feet long, mid bellies, 60 to 70 feet, and then long bellies, 70 foot plus. And that is the length of the head or the line that you cast at all times. It can be casted and brought back in. Say you have a 60-foot head, you can bring that back in at cast, but the rating was to have that entire length of head out off the end of the rod tip. Hence, if you have a long line, there's no stripping. Like we talked about the drawbacks of a Skagit head, right? We talked about have to constantly strip that in, but if you have an opportunity to fish a 50 or 60-foot spay line, there's no stripping. You basically cast it out, you swing, it just takes less time because you don't spend wasted time stripping in. So there are huge advantages of having a full line rather than a shooting head if the venue allows you to do that. So Did you notice that I said the AFTA standard head lengths start at 30 feet, right? That's where they start at. You're like, what the heck, Jeff? I have this Skagit head that's like 15 foot long and another one that's like 19 foot long. Nowhere close to 30 feet. Well, it was the skinny. Skagit heads started off around 30 to 31 foot long, and it progressively got shorter along with some specialty rods to match them. It started out in the Pacific Northwest, and the frontiers over there was many of them. They kept working on the system, the shooting head systems, and they got shorter and shorter, going from the ratio of around 3 to 3.5 times the length of the rod, all the way down now to some of the specialty really short heads, which are 2 to 2.5 times the length of your rod for the whole fishing system. The cool thing is that my schooling came from one of the best, Jerry French. Having the opportunity to spend time with him and listen to a few key bullet points, I was finally able truly to understand the whole Skagit system. Jerry was the guide up in Alaska, in the OP, on the Skagit River, and he was one of in the clique that was really working on all these lines. And the key factors were, and so you listen to this, Skagit casts are not a spay cast. They're a tactical two-handed cast. Skagit heads are not a spay line or a spay head. They are a compact tactical shooting head that requires a tip looped onto the front that was designed for fishing and not beautiful casts. Here's the real important one that really struck home. He referred the head to a bullet, like a projectile, that carries a big payload of flies or tip, and the shooting line goes along for the ride. This compact head system, with its compact casting, continuous motion cast, has changed the two-handed swung fly game forever. And it's my go-to in my home waters in and around the Great Lakes. And it should be on the top of your list to maybe have one of these to match up even just your single-hand rod if you don't want to dive into the two-handed or switch rod game too. So that's where I got that from, and it was very eye-opening. And there are 3 basic categories of lines, and there's 3 basic, but I'd have to say the Skagit system is going to be one of a go-to for almost everything, even if you have a trout spay and you're looking to fish big streamers, right? You're not going to use a Skagit line to fish soft hackles for trout spay, but, in our area, most of the time, if we're going to do that, we'll just use our single-hand floating lines. So Skagit system. Cool thing about it is that you can get it on your single-hand rod. If you have a 8-footer even, you can still get a single-hand Skagit line for that. You can use it on your single hand, you can use them on your switch rods, and you can use it on a full two-handed rods which are 12 foot and over like we talked about. I don't think once you get above 14 feet, not that you can't, I think the application around the Great Lakes, our rods are going to be a little shorter, like we said, 14 and under. If you get over 14 feet, yes, that you can get a Skagit line that grains super heavy, over 600 grains, 650 to do the job. But it's in the Great Lakes. There's not much that requires us to do that. So these Skagit heads are the shortest, and they work and shine the best when you have a fixed anchor cast, where the line and tip is adhered to the water most of the cast, and it's a continuous motion cast to keep this big, thick, heavy line moving, the projectile moving with no pause, and there might be a little hesitation to this cast, but it's more of a continuous motion cast. It has no front taper. Some of the Skagit heads have this very minute taper, but it's almost something that you have to really closely inspect it to notice that the butt section of this shooting head is thicker than the front portion. And that's the key to this, is that it's with low taper to it. It's that bullet, right? It always needs a tip looped onto the front of it, or a sinking leader for the lighter Skagit heads. Always have to have it. If you were fishing and want to fish floating, you have to put a floating tip on the end of a Skagit head. It'll change the load of the rod. It'll be a little heavier, but one thing you never want to do is I see a lot is anglers get their Skagit head and then they practice or try to practice and they just loop on their traditional mono leader onto the front of this Skagit head and it just doesn't cast. You always have to put a tip. It's best for the big flies and big sink tips. And I think why it's so popular and easy, one of the reasons why it was designed was it's easier for a beginner angler to cast sink tips at a fishing distance. You know, these really weren't meant to bomb it out really super far. They were meant to cast at a fairly moderate casting distance and fish from mid-river to the bank. You know, if the river's a little smaller, sure, you can bomb it out there, but they really shine for that type of fishing situation. It also shines in tight casting situations when your back is against the wall or you have overhanging trees that you got to work your rod tip through because the D-loop, because the head is so short, is very small and compact. It's offered also in an intermediate sinking, which means the entire Skagit head sinks 1 to 2 inches per second. Very, very popular on the larger rivers, especially when we get into fishing from a boat on Michigan's larger rivers like the Muskegon or the Big Manistee. It's their go-to winter line. All the captains there and the guides will probably go into an intermediate sinking head there. It's also good to have in and around my Great Lakes region when we get the cold water, that intermediate sinking Skagit head. It offers me the main advantage that if you're looking at an intermediate Skagit head is that to slow things down and get away from the confused current, I can use an intermediate Skagit head with a very light sink tip on it, where if I was to use a floating one in the winter, I would have to start increasing my sink tip for higher flows and dirtier water. And when you add the sink tip and you start increasing the sink rate and you get up into the T14s and the T11s and T12s, it can get a little harder to cast compared to just using a lighter sink tip with that intermediate head. So the cons, one of the drawbacks is when you're casting at distance and which we don't do a lot on the Great Lakes, but if you're casting at distance, there's this wasted time of stripping in that running line or shooting line back to the next cast. It's, a lot of times it's a wasted cast where if you were to have a longer head, there's less stripping and it's all about being efficient, covering that run faster and not wasting time stripping in that line and then recasting back out. So it's a time-consuming thing, but we're not shooting a whole lot of line. We're shooting anywhere from 3 pulls off the reel to 12 is a long shot. We're not pulling out 20 strips in around the Great Lakes at all. Another disadvantage is it's not very stealthy, right? Because we have this short projectile, very big mass, like a garden hose we're flinging around, right? It's like controlled chaos casting. You could spook fish in clear water. Even though the fish are going to be downstream of you swinging a fly, a lot of times, you might huck a cast out off the boat or off the bank and it pile drives down on a pile cast and you might have spooked a fish that did bite in front of you, even though your fly's being presented downstream of you and below you. That landing, sometimes in clear water can basically just stir the pool up a little bit. I know they're not really wanted up in Nova Scotia in the Atlantic salmon, fishery. The guides are like, they want you to cast overhead. They don't want you to touch the line because it's like water's like vodka a lot of times and they feel it'll spook the fish. So that's the Skagit system. The next is going to be a Scandinavian system. It can be for single hand or switch or two-handed applications. So this Scandinavian system is a shooting head. It's very popular, over in Europe is where it came from. It has a front taper to it. If you want to sort of look into it, think of a Skagit head that basically has the front taper attached to it, like looping a front floating tip on your Skagit head. The belly is the driver, and the Skagit system does not have the front taper. It's just the driver, and the Scandinavian has that front taper built into it.
Imagine embarking on a journey to Alaska, that ultimate destination for adventure seekers. With FishHound Expeditions, this dream can become your reality. Picture yourself amidst the wild Alaskan landscape where the northern lights dance across the sky and you're reeling in some of the biggest rainbow trout you've ever seen. It's an experience that feels like a dream, but with FishHound, it's an adventure waiting to happen. If Alaska is on your bucket list, FishHound Expeditions is the key to unlocking that dream. Visit fishhoundexpeditions.com today and mention that you discovered them through this podcast. That's FISHHOUND Expeditions. Don't just dream about Alaska, experience it with FishHound.
One of the very popular lines that's really go-to around the Great Lakes is the Rio versus Scandi, because they allow you to loop on and off their Scandinavian heads. And it's sort of like a Skagit system on steroids, because it does handle that. So that's one of the popular ones that is in and around the Great Lakes. This front taper on these Scandinavian lines, determining on the rod weight and the grain weight, it's around 10 to 15 feet long. It comes in a wide choices of head that, most of the time is going to be floating. But believe it or not, the European systems, what ends up happening is that they actually carry full Scandinavian heads, from floating and then all the way down to a sink 8, like we talked about. They don't change tips like we do on a Skagit system. They actually will say, all right, I need to get deeper. They loop off a floating Scandinavian, and they might put on one that's like what's called a hover or an intermediate or a type 3, which means the entire Scandinavian head sinks at 3 inches per second. So we carry around a tip wallet or a leader wallet, and we exchange that, where on the Scandinavian system, it is going to be more of switching out the entire head to get fishing depth if you need to get deeper. So one good thing about the Scandinavian heads is that you can utilize overhead casts. It shines very well with what's called touch and go casts or kiss and go casts, where it momentarily catches like a single spaze, which allows you not to do an extra motion to set up a waterborne cast, but it also does fixed anchor cast well too. So it's a very high line speed. If you have a full Scandinavian line on a head, and this even goes for Skagit, is that if you're fishing a nylon monofilament leader or fluorocarbon leaders, the leader has to be the length of the rod or longer. So if you've got a 12-foot rod, that leader needs to be at least 12 feet to allow it to adhere and get that friction of where the water meets the line and the leader to load the rod, because it is a waterborne cast. You can't put a sink tip on the end of a Scandinavian because it has a built-in taper to it, and if you put a sink tip on it, you'll go from the taper being really thin down by the loop where you would attach your flies and leaders, and then you would actually increase the thickness with the sink tip and go down. It just doesn't work. You always have to continue that taper down. So you're going to end up using sinking leaders on the end of your floating Scandinavian if you want to get deeper, or weighted flies, or switch out your Scandinavian heads if you want to really get into the Scandinavian system. It is best, and it really shines for wet flies, lighter body flies, or dry flies. It is very, very, very stealthful. It enters the water very, very quietly. It's not the best going to be in windy conditions. It shines when there's not as much wind, but for those presentations, and it's very popular for summer run steelheads. It's very popular for trout spay. So those are the ways it shines. because it's a little bit longer and it's a little bit elongated compared to a Skagit, the line mending abilities is going to be a little bit better too. It's definitely stealthy when it enters the water, so it does have some advantages when it comes down to when you're thinking about what you really want to achieve. The one thing, that the reason why the Scandinavian system is not as popular as the Skagit system for our migratory trout around the Great Lakes is that because there's a taper to it, it doesn't want to huck big payloads. So, if the waters are a little bit blown out, and because that tapers down to thinner towards the loop, towards your leader or your sinking leader, it dissipates the energy. And if you're fishing a big weighted fly or a really big air-resistant fly, it has a tendency to be a little more difficult to cast. Once you get the feel for it, it's fine, but it does have a little bit of a learning curve, and especially if you start putting on some bigger flies, you'll notice it dramatically. So that's why it really shines with the wet flies and the dry flies, and the small little cone-weighted flies, it really shines. So that was the Scandinavian system, and let's basically dive into the full spay, like basically what everything started at. It's the traditional classic spay line, right? That's where everything started at, right? It's usually for a full two-handed rod. It works the best, 13-foot rod and all the way up to, like we talked about, 18-footers. But in our geographic area, that 14 to 15-foot rod is the sweet spot for, that. You can throw the longest lines with it. It would be very difficult to cast a 60-foot head on a switch rod, right? So this is where the full two-handed rods and the after specs, because that's how it all got started. So it's great. So a classic analogy is long casts, long lines, longer rods. If you want to cast far, you got to have a longer line. You don't see Spay-O-Rama when they're casting up over 150 feet consistently. They're not using a shooting head of 30 feet or 25 feet, right? It's just ridiculous, right? They're using lines that are roughly in and around 70 feet, 68 to 72 feet, and then they shoot the rest of that 100 foot of shooting line behind it. Long casts, long lines, right? And there's no need to stripping that shooting line in, because you have this longer traditional line, even if it's 50 or 60 feet, with that leader or your sinking leader, your fish is 70 foot out without stripping. It's very efficient. I think the only venue that I've found that I use it a lot is on the St. Mary's River. That's our big water in the Great Lakes. It drains Lake Superior down into Lake Huron, and in and around the Canadian waters called the Burn. We fish it from shoreline there. And the water is vodka clear. There's an Atlantic salmon program there. There's a steelhead program there, salmon, pink salmon. But those Atlantic salmon will come to the surface with the predominant caddis hatch in the evenings. And it's not uncommon to use wet flies or dry flies there to catch those Atlantics. So that's big casts, floating lines. That's really where it shines in the Great Lakes. So the grain weights and lines are a science of all their own. And it would take an entire episode to cover all of its secrets, right? Because these lines are, they're meant to be fished off the end of the rod tip at length, whatever the head length is. You can also cast them with the line and the head down inside the rod, but that's a whole nother level of discussion. If you ever want to really dig deep into it, reach out to Timmy Arsenault with Bridge Fly Lines. He's one of the world's best bait casters, and he's got his own line company. He can really help you out when it comes down to dotting all the I's multiple times, and he's got it super dialed in. That or Travis Hartman out on the West Coast. But so the cons is that if you have a longer line, it's hard to cast at 90-degree angles in tighter river conditions because of the larger D-loops, right? That's the reason why we don't use them a lot around here, is because, on bigger rivers, sure, summer run rivers out west like the Deschutes, no problem. But in and around the Great Lakes, we have a lot of tight river conditions, right? And we don't have the room to use these big, long traditional spay lines. Some of the guys and guides that are using indicator rigs are utilizing these really long lines to fish long drifts on the larger rivers like the Big Manistee. Johnny Ray's using that to fish big indicator rigs to get very good mending at distance on these big rivers. So there is some applications, but it's not to make traditional swung fly presentations. And then the last con is there's not much of a payload delivery with them because of that elongated line with that taper down towards the front. So that would be probably one of the other major reasons why people don't really get into it. So, how many lines, and heads to match up the rods? A single hand or two-handed rods. Start out with the brand suggestions, when it comes down to the line perfectly matching up, right? That's going to be the king, of that. Just always go back to the rod manufacturer or even the line companies and reach out to their customer service, and they'll be more than happy for you to get all those line and grain weights dialed in for your rod, especially if you're struggling. But most of the time right now, there's a lot of good online information that you can go on their websites and be able to do that. A simple test on your own is distinguishing from a Scandinavian grain weight to a Skagit grain weight would be if you have your Scandinavian line on and it's very easy for you to cast overhead and control your loop size and it doesn't feel heavy or doggy, then it's right on. If it's on the heavy side, the opposite would be you struggle, and you can't control your loops and it just wants to have collision loops and it wants the tail on you. That means your Scandinavian line is going to be a little bit heavy. So Scandinavian lines are meant to be cast overhead. So you can always go back and forth with that. But that's just a rule of thumb. If it feels doggy overhead casting, it's a little heavy. Simple test when you're choosing a Skagit line grain weight is if you can cast overhead and control the loops and it feels like casting your single hand rods like with your standard lines on it, then it's grained on the light side. When grained for Skagit casting, it should feel really heavy and you would need to open up your loop with a big stroke and keep the loops open, and having tailing loops or collision loops. That's how it's going to want to feel. They're meant to be cast off the water, and it's going to be very important to actually understand that Skagit lines are really not meant to be cast overhead. When you investigate, your rods and the recommended specs and lines and heads, you always will see a low grain and a high grain window that the rod performs in, right? They're going to give you these recommendations. The safe choice is right in the middle between the low and high grain recommendations. A rule, a general rule of thumb is to go by that Scandinavian heads are usually around 50 to 75 grains lighter than your Skagit head would be. And the opposite, if you have a Scandinavian head, you would grain up to make your Skagit head that way. And that's just a good rule of thumb. And even if you notice that if you see some of the custom rod builders, the Berkheimers and the Meisners and things like that, and the Andersons, they usually say, the rod, this two-handed rod is a 5.67 or a 7.89, right? Because they know as a custom rod builder that there's a huge window in order to remember, bend and load the rod, the spring. It's a personal preference thing too. So always think of that when you're looking to match those two-handed and switch rod lines. For my Scandi system, I carry two different grain weight heads along with some multi-densities, but in general, I carry a lighter one for high line speeds in low to no wind conditions, and then I carry one weight above that, 50 grains higher, for high wind conditions, a little larger flies, and if I wanted to fish a sinking leader under those nasty conditions, like if it gets really windy. And when I mean windy, I would say that it's going to be up over 18 miles an hour, 20 mile an hour with gust up to 30 miles an hour or more. That's pretty tough casting in river conditions. For my Skagit system, I prefer graining on the lighter side. that allows me to make a little bit of a touch and go where I can, don't use the word, but bastardize a Scandinavian touch and go cast with a sustained anchor cast. I sort of grain them in between. That way it's not real beautiful. It's more of a crash and burn and go, but sometimes I can actually make a single hand spade cast with my Skagit system. So I sort of try to keep on that lower grain window of the recommendations of my rods. Last on the checklist is going to be shooting lines, right? This is if we have a head system of Scandinavian or Skagit, we have that shooting line, and some people call it running line, but it's not running anywhere. We're actually shooting it, right? So shooting line is actually the technical terminology, and this is what goes along for the ride, and that we strip back in at the end of the swung fly presentation. But so we have mono, we have standard fly line, and then we have to worry about the diameter, and then we also have some options of no stretch. I think it's just not so much. I think you have to look at the mono. I think it'll be easier for a beginner to shoot line with mono. The drawbacks of mono is that it basically wants to has a lot of memory, wants to coil. So you always have to stretch out the mono, right? You stretch it out before your cast. You might even have to stretch it out if there's going to be some temperature changes, but it is going to be your go-to if you need to cast at distance. I like mono in the winter because it doesn't hold water like a traditional fly line, shooting line would, and I don't get my gloves as wet. The drawback is it's very slick and it's hard to hold with gloves. So I think it's a personal preference thing as we're talking about shooting lines. A standard fly line shooting line is great. It offers you the option that it's easier to hold. It has some thickness to it. It doesn't want to tangle in behind your reel, arbor, and spool and get wadded up there like if you have too thin of a mono. So that's just a good baseline if you were thinking about it to go ahead and get the standard fly line shooting line system. And they come with larger loops generally that allows you to loop on different heads or whatever you need to, compared to mono where you're tying your own loop on the end of that mono there, small or large, personal preference. So let's talk a little bit about diameter. And this is I think the only thing you really need to sort of chime in on and listen to is that the diameter is very important, because if you have, say, a very small diameter shooting line with a very, very heavy shooting head, it's going to want to cast really well, but you're going to get a lot of tangles up at your stripper guide because the line speed of that head is shooting out so fast that shooting line cannot get through the guides fast enough, and they just tank and tangle up. And you also need to have a thick enough diameter to actually hold the bottom leg of that shooting head back to form a loop. A little rule of thumb is, if you're using mono, is if you have a head weight that's going to be under 500, or somewhere around 500 or so, about a 42-pound test is perfect. And if you start dropping down in close to 300, you're going to want to run a 35-pound test mono. And if you get up over 550 and start getting into those 8 weights, I usually use a 50-pound test mono. The same if you have a standard. If you have a 32 thousandths standard shooting line with the standard fly line, that's going to be for your lighter ones. The 38 thousandths is going to be your average, and your 42 thousandths is going to be a little bit thicker. I'd have to say 38 is a good all-around one to stick with as far as diameter for standard shooting lines, give or take. And then there's the factor, some of the manufacturers have the no stretch. That's really good at distance. It allows you to feel a little more sensitive with the low stretch, but it has drawbacks of maybe not being as consistent as far as durability. So there's all sorts of drawbacks too. And also, I use a lot of mono because if I have low stretch, I feel that if I have the sensitivity, the fish have the sensitivity too to feel you back, right? I like to have that little elasticity. I fish a little higher rod, And I want them not to feel when they're starting to get a little plucky or you get a fish you're wanting to come back on and not super aggressive and really coming to the fly. I just like that little bit of cushion of not, them not knowing that I'm there, right? Well, that pretty much covers everything. I think it's time to wrap things up with this part 2. But the next time, you're on your water, I want you to paint a picture that you are the captain, the line is your ship, and the rod is the rudder. And the better you can control the rudder, your ship, you will sail to your destination better. So always think about that. You're always in control of this chaos from casting to fishing. Your eyes are your best tool to learn the cast and to watch what goes on when you're doing the presentation. Well, thanks for the listen. I hope this part 2 episode shines some light on a few more topics, answered a few questions for, the listener that are just getting started out and digging into all this. And for you that's had more water time, I hope you picked up a few tips with this episode. If you have any questions on rods or lines or any comments, reach out to Dave or me, and we'll be happy to contact you back and get you all dialed in. For the next time, Great Lakes Dude, I'm out.
That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country, so if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are, and I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.